G'day City Skylines fans, and we're back with another Dev Diary and feature highlight. This is number 4, Zones and Signature Buildings. And this time we're going to deep dive into the zoning tools, a lot of which we're already familiar with the current game, but also zone types, and we've had confirmation of mixed zoning, as well as 6 different zoning types, and a new, more complex calculation for the zoning demands. So residential demand, for example, works a lot different to what we're used to just now. So let's take a look. So like in previous videos, I've had a look at the video and I will provide a link to that below, but we're going to have a look at the Dev Diary because there's much more detail in that, and it just helps us get a better understanding of each of the various parts relating to zoning. So we start off with zoning tools, and in terms of the features here, we're probably quite familiar with these: the fill, the marquee, the paint tool. I think probably the biggest change to these really is the dezoning is simplified. So now we can just right click if you're using PC and we can dezone. So it's very easy, or much more easier for us to correct little mistakes, or if we're trying to zone a specific way or in a specific area, just makes it a little bit more easier for us. The other feature they've added is in terms of architectural themes, and when we start a map we have the option to choose what architectural style we want from the beginning, so whether that's North American or European, which are the two choices that we have. But once we're in their building, we do have that option to put, say, European buildings in a North American style map and vice versa. But the slight tweak from what we're used to seeing there is that architectural theme also influences the type of service vehicles as well as the look and feel. Then we move on to zone types, and this is where under the residential zone we have 6 different zone types now. So we'll be used to low density housing and high density housing, so that's very similar in CS2. But now they've added a few more different types. So medium density row housing is that wall to wall look we're familiar with, that I also personally quite like. But we also have medium density housing with apartment buildings as well. And I know there's been a lot of speculation, but now they've confirmed mixed zoning or mixed housing, with shops occupying the ground floor and apartments above. So very much more closer to real life, what we're probably used to seeing in cities around the world. Then we have a new type called low rent housing, and this one caters for our students or young adults, and ties back to a previous Dev Diary about how they're the types of citizens who would have low income, so that style of housing is what they find attractive. Then they go on to explain how it's a little bit different to what we're used to. So low and medium density housing tend to have larger apartments, which most residents find appealing. However, the cost of living is usually higher in smaller buildings such as detached houses, row houses and medium-sized apartment buildings, as the costs are divided among fewer households. And then they start talking about land value, and we come on to this in a little bit more detail later on, but land value affects smaller buildings more as it affects the size of the rent in general. Alternatively, high density housing can fit more people in a smaller area, but the main negative aspect there is that apartments are usually small. So we're seeing these trade-offs like we've seen in previous Dev Diaries, that certain buildings and zoning types is attractive to certain sims. Then we get some insight into commercial zones, and again what we're used to seeing is low and high density, so that will remain the same. But they've gone into more detail around this time round, and they're saying that low density businesses are usually boutiques, gas stations, small stores and bars, whereas high density tend to be supermarkets, department stores and more recreational locations such as theatres and hotels. And then they talk about how commercial businesses benefit from local manufacturing, so having quick access to the goods that they're selling and not having to pay a higher price to ship goods from further afield. Then industrial zoning is slightly different, so just one level of zoning we're told in the Dev Diary here, and it's divided into manufacturing companies and warehouses. So this is a little bit different and a little bit interesting. They're saying manufacturing encompasses most of the industrial zones as factories and workshops, while warehouses will appear here and there, answering to the needs of the different companies and their production processes. So really talking about these warehouses popping up as and when needed, with the ability when there's an overproduction to store excess goods and take more time to decide how they're distributed around the city. So there's this real focus on distributing locally as a lower cost option compared with distributing to outside connections, which is really interesting. I think the only concern for me is, do we have the option to put down warehouses like we do now? I quite like that option to have that level of control, but from the explanation I'm seeing here, correct me if I'm wrong because I've sped read this, so I could be wrong. But yeah, I would also like the opportunity to maybe put my own warehouses down as well. But yeah, they do make a big thing about the fact that local access to these goods is more profitable because it's a lower transportation cost, and conversely, continuing to sell to outside connections will further decrease that profit because the goods have to travel further and further to those new buyers. So yeah, an interesting dynamic there. Then office zones have got a revamp, so we see low density and high density. Again, we see that just now, but this is where it takes a turn just slightly left. So office companies convert technological goods manufactured in industrial zones into software, and then further from there they can process them into telecoms, finance and media. So very different to what we're seeing just now. Obviously we have the financial specialization or what have you, but this looks like that's how office zones work from the start. Then they go on to say that software itself is not something that you sell to private customers, but once you produce something out of it like telecoms or finance, then you have a wider reach for those private customers who'll also benefit from them, and then media can be sold directly to citizens in the form of consumer electronics, video games and such like. So what I do like is the zone suitability, which is an info view they talk about sort of activating when you start to zone. So depending on the zone type, that appears and gives you more information about the zone you're about to lay or put down and the suitability of that. So for example, commercial zoning, where potential customers are located in the city, so that you're not effectively zoning commercial in an area where it's just going to go abandoned because there's no demand. So that looks like a good thing to me. I don't know, from what I've seen so far, we might rely on that heavily, because it sounds to me so far from what I'm seeing is that zoning is far more complicated than what we're used to just now. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Then we come on to zone demand, so again similar to what we're used to seeing just now, which is logical, and I'm glad it's staying the same, which is when new citizens move in and require housing, residential demand increases. When they need jobs and places to go shopping, then industrial and commercial demand increases. So that's logical, that makes sense. What's different this time is we can adjust taxes for the different education levels, which is not something that we can do just now. So we can tailor taxes to be used in favor of different goods and products manufacturing in the city to really get down to that granular level and tweak things in a way where we have total control. Then it breaks down residential demand, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because again there's a lot of similarities that we're used to. I think the key thing probably is that they're calling out that families and seniors prefer large apartments, thus increasing low and medium density housing demand, and single person households and students don't shy away from smaller apartments, so that would obviously increase that associated demand. Similar with commercial demand, obviously when goods and products are developed by your industry, they need somewhere to sell those, or a business to sell those on their behalf, so that's where you get your commercial demand from. Then it goes on to talk about industrial demand, and that's based on citizens needing jobs in the manufacturing sector, as well as local commercial companies requiring goods and products to sell, so that's what's driving that demand. It also talks about that demand being further increased by the availability of local resource extraction, and it doesn't have a picture here, but when you watch the video we see the farm, and what I thought was quite cool about that is you could see the player, or whoever that was recording the video, and you could see them tailoring the farm around that road so that they're no longer perfectly square or rectangle. We can kind of change them to the shape of the roads that were built. That's really exciting for me because at the moment I use decals to do that, so I can't wait to see how that works. And then again, they touched back on warehouses and the fact that companies only have a relatively small storage facility, so they will seek to sell all their products as quickly as possible, and warehouses allow more flexibility and time to seek suitable new buyers. Then we get on to office demand, and this is a little bit more kind of linked into manufacturing industry and how industry and other office companies benefit from the software developed in the office zones. And as software is produced, more office companies appear as they can further develop the software into other services. So that's a little bit different to what we're used to seeing. And then there's that constant tie back to the citizens. So depending on the age range of customers, different types of immaterial goods are preferred. Adults and seniors favor banking services and products from the financial sector, while children and teens consume more media products. And then we talk about land value and building levels, and this is where it really changes. So it goes on to talk about how citizens tend to value large homes, the proximity of shops, services they require, schools, workplace, pollution-free locations that we're used to seeing just now. If they're happy, they obviously move in, and if they're wealthy enough, they can pay the rent, which translates into an increase in the area's land value. But they do point out here that simply plopping all the city services into a neighbourhood doesn't increase the land value automatically, and I guess that's probably where we start to deviate. And an example of that is if the rent is higher than the upkeep cost of the building, the residents pull their leftover funds into improving the building, which eventually leads to the building levelling up. So this is, not something we've seen currently. And I guess it's something I'm struggling a little bit with. I maybe need to see how it works when we get in game, because it starts to go on that if there's high demand for a specific zone type, it can also increase the rent. But then conversely, if the rent gets too high, the rent decreases and the land value starts to drop, or the residents will move out. So I don't know if this is a good level of complexity or a bad level of complexity. I guess, as I said again, it'll be interesting to see what that's like when we play the game. What do you think? Tell me in the comments below. But I think I need to read through this in a little more detail. And I think the part where that gets slightly confusing is when they say to keep the land value in check, in brackets, if needed. So it sounds like left unchecked, that could almost be detrimental, because potentially the residential buildings there become too expensive to afford for most people, or you only get one type of person in that area, which drastically affects things around it. So an interesting layer of complexity there, a bit of a head scratcher. I'm not sure if this is a good thing or not. And then we see that if more and more residents move out in greater numbers and the building becomes abandoned, that further decreases the land value. Then abandoned buildings can become occupied by homeless citizens, but if the constant state of disrepair continues, then the building eventually collapses. So just a more complicated kind of structure around land value and building levels than we're used to seeing now. Then keeping that in mind, that's driving how we then approach the game, because if lower income families tend to prefer sort of medium density housing, so apartment buildings, then we need to make sure that we've got those areas for them to move into, and then keep in mind that with smaller homes, if the land value skyrockets, that the citizens could struggle to pay the rent. Then we get insight into how companies evaluate suitable locations and the fact that they use land value and the size of the rent, which is then subtracted from the value of the company's production. So again, adding that extra layer that we're not used to seeing just now, they consider locations and also the material transportation costs, and all these things affect whether or not a company will choose to move into a particular area or not. So it doesn't seem to me like it's just as easy as zoning residential or commercial and then everything just spawns in. There's more complexity surrounding it than that. Then they touch on building levels. We have levels 1 to 5 for zoned buildings, and they represent the progression of the building from a lower to a higher quality of building and are a reflection of how wealthy its inhabitants are. Then obviously, as we've touched on before, as the level increases, the upkeep increases as well. Then the last section is signature buildings. So again, to me, the way that was explained, it sounds like unique buildings with a little bit of a twist. The similarities being that each one has its own unlocking requirements. So you have to meet those requirements whether it's progression to a certain milestone, attaining a specific citizen happiness level, and having a certain number of zone cells, then you unlock that, and that can be placed wherever you like across your city. Obviously, depending on what benefits it has, is where that would dictate your placement within your city. Where they differ from unique buildings, though, is that they contribute to the zone-based economic cycle. So if the building was residential related, for example, then obviously the demand for that specific residential component would lower, and the same laws of success and failure apply in terms of companies residing in the building, etc., etc. Then, depending on what the signature building is, it has one or more positive effects, and that can range from just that neighborhood to a citywide effect. And that could be attractiveness for tourists or boosting a certain level of education and things like that. Again, similar to what we're used to seeing now. So there we have it, feature highlight number 4, zones and signature buildings, along with the Dev Diary blog. So what are the key takeaways? I guess zoning tools are largely the same, a nice touch with the architectural themes, but will we see maybe more content creator packs being released to change those building styles? I do like the 2 styles personally as a starting point. I think North American and European makes sense, and from the pictures we've seen, they look nice enough to me. The zone types look interesting. Do we think the residential zone type is a little too complicated now, or are we happy with that? Is the added complexity to land value and building levels a step too far? Will it lead to massive areas of the city going abandoned if rents are too high? And will that get annoying? Can we place our own warehouses, or are they tied into industry zoning? Only time will tell. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll catch you next time. As ever, have a great day, and thanks again for watching.